All right, so this week we're concerned with what scholars and historians refer to as the so-called Baroque period, and it's a period that's kind of roughly dated to the 1600s, the 17th century, maybe a little bit of the early part of the 18th century, the 1700s, and it's marked, at least when we're talking about the arts, music and the visual arts, it's marked by a kind of wildness, a kind of maybe to the modern eye, it would look like over detailed, or like more is more is the philosophy of Baroque art. And so I want to look at today in this lecture. I want to look at a couple of artists, Italian artists again, Caravaggio and Bernini, who I think are emblematic of this kind of late Renaissance, early Baroque period, and we'll kind of consider some of these broader issues and kind of see how their work and how their life stories fit into this particular schematic. And in the second lecture this week, we're going to look at for the first time in this class, we'll look at music, and the Baroque period is a revolutionary time in music, and some of these notables like Bach, are his kind of his fantastically detailed and complex fugues and such, in many ways are emblematic of kind of the Baroque period of art, and so kind of that wildness and complex detail carries over into the musical realm as well as we'll see in the physical and the static arts as well. And other art historians, looking more broadly, have kind of recognized that these kinds of movements tend to kind of go in cycles throughout history. So if you look back at, we're going way back here. If you look at kind of in the kind of the waves of artistic expression in ancient Greece, you have this era which is called the Archaic era, where the Greeks are starting to kind of sculpt lifelike, oversized sculptures of human bodies. You can tell this example is what's called a kuro statue of a boy. It's still very stiff. It's very static. Some have suggested that this era of art was deeply inspired by the Egyptians, which could date back even earlier. It's very possible. These look like a lot of these large, monumental, static, stiff statues that the Egyptians produced. And then later on in the so-called classical period, which is sometimes called kind of the high point of Greek culture, you have sculptures here like the famous discus thrower, the discobolus, and the emphasis is on realism, is on balance, is on harmony. You can see how much more realistic and smooth and balanced the sculpture is compared to the kind of the stiff archaic sculpture. And it's kind of also, but it's also very much idealized. The proportions of the figure are perfected. There's the attention to the veins and the muscles. It's lifelike, but it's also idealized. And then on the heels of the classical era, we have what's called the Hellenistic world, and this is happens when Alexander the Great from Macedon conquers Greece, conquers what we call Turkey, all the way to India, and spreads what we call Hellenistic or Greek culture throughout the known world at the time. And the Hellenistic era produces sculptures along these lines. This is what's called the Laocoon. It's a famous scene from Greek mythology in the Trojan cycle. And here, again, there's almost a hyper realism, and there's kind of an emphasis on wildness and horror and anguish and such. You compare the kind of the calm nature of the discus thrower. His emotions are in balance, his emotions are in control. But this man who's being attacked by snakes, and he's losing his children also to the same monsters. His face is twisted into agony. It's a hyper realism that's kind of dwelling in the wildness of emotions and horror. Now, fast forward to closer to the era that we're talking about, and you get a similar kind of rhythm as you go from the medieval period to the Renaissance period, which we've been talking a lot about, to the Baroque period, which we're going to start talking about today. And it's almost as if the cycles, the styles of art go through these same movements. If you look at medieval art, and one of the things that marks the medieval period, that is that so much of classical learning has been forgotten, and it's almost that like humanity has to rediscover how to do these things that the Greeks and the Romans had perfected centuries before. And so you have these very, again, kind of stiff, out of proportion, free sculptures here, marking the medieval era. And I recognize I'm just picking out pieces not randomly, but just kind of using examples of one to make a point. And so, take these things with a grain of salt. But I'm trying to illustrate a larger truth here. Compared to the Renaissance, here's a statue of again dipping into classical mythology as they often did. This is Perseus with the head of Medusa in his hand. It's much more balanced. It's much more harmonious. It's much more realistic. But there's also kind of an idealization of the proportions and such. You have kind of that classical nudity, which speaks to divinity. And then fast forward to the Baroque. Here's a sculpture by Bernini, a guy that we'll talk about later in this lecture. This is again tapping into classical myth. This is the god Hades kidnapping Persephone, and again there's a hyper realism. If you see how the fingers of Hades, this is carved from marble, are digging into her flesh here, and it's so realistic. But in terms of the subject matter, it's it's a focus on emotion. It's a focus on horror. It's a focus on wildness. Things are just kind of barely under control. Compare Perseus here. He has just beheaded Medusa, but look at his face. He's kind of solemn, calm, controlled. That's a very kind of classical bearing, as we saw in the discus thrower, centuries before this. And then in the Baroque period, like the Laocoon, the focus again is on turbulent emotion and wildness. And so these things, we might see as a kind of a cycle of history. These things repeat themselves throughout the centuries. Even if you compare the three Davids produced, kind of over across, early Renaissance, we have Donatello's David and Michelangelo's David. They are very much in that classical vein, confident, realistic, idealized. Michelangelo, as we talked about, kind of famously, he kind of shows David before the act, contemplating the act. He's calm. He's in control. He knows that he's going to take down Goliath in just a moment. Then over here, here's Bernini again. He also carves a David, but look at kind of the furrowed brow of concentration. He's ready to go. He's in the midst of the act. He's drawing. He's about to fling the sling. It's a much more of a David that's focused on the act, on the violence, on the emotion and such. And therefore, it's kind of, this is Baroque, and this is very Renaissance. This is Hellenistic. This is very classical, as is Donatello's David over here. All right, to turn to kind of the first of our two artists that we're going to look at in this lecture, the famous artist who's known today usually just simply by this last name here, Caravaggio, which is taken not from the names that his parents gave him, but from the town that he grew up in. His real name was Michelangelo Merisi, and so it's helpful that we know him as Caravaggio because we already have another Michelangelo who we talked about at length. So Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, Michelangelo Merisi, the one from the town of Caravaggio. With so many of these guys, their biographies are hard to pin down. It's difficult to, in some cases, to say concrete things. We know that he was born in this town of Caravaggio, which is in northern Italy near Milan, sometime around the year 1571. We don't know a lot, but we do know that something terrible happened in his family. A wave of plague hit that area where he lived as a young boy, as often happened during this era, and his entire family, except of course himself, is wiped out, and so he's left as an orphan, really on his own, really nowhere to go as a very young boy, 8, 9, maybe 10 years old. And some have said that this obviously would have left a tremendously dark mark on Caravaggio as a young boy. And it's thought that darkness follows him throughout his life and that spills over into so many of his paintings. So here's a map. So here's Caravaggio up here in the province of Lombardy up here in northern Italy. You can see how close it is to the large city of Milan, which was growing in prominence and power at this time. That's where, as we learned, Leonardo was called away a number of times to go work for the Duke of Milan and to live at his expense. So by about age 11, he's on his own. There's nothing left for him in the town of Caravaggio. So he goes to Milan. Apparently, he's already showing talent as an artist. We don't know exactly know how, but like Michelangelo, he's thought to have been a child prodigy. He falls in with a group of starving artists in Milan, which was kind of half artist commune and half street gang. And they were known by their Latin motto, nec spe nec metu, which means neither by hope, neither by fear. Like without hope, without fear. Very bleak. And so, he bounced around for a bit. He seems to have maybe had a brief apprenticeship in Rome, Sorry, in Milan, but he moves on to Rome in the hopes of greener pastures and such. We don't know really anything. I mean, it's very possibly that this apprenticeship fell apart because of his disagreeability. He was famously had a hot temper, and this we'll see as this gets him in big trouble later in his life. But as he kind of gets into his teens, his early teens and late teens, no matter his economic circumstances were fairly bleak in this part of his life, he's painting and painting and painting and painting. An extremely productive artist, almost kind of has like a manic, uncontrollable passion for this that he has no choice but to paint. So here are some of his early works. I mean, a good number of his works survive. That we have a nice selection across his fairly short life. I get a sense of the man as an artist. So here we have this is thought to be a self-portrait of him with a basket of fruit. Here he is. This is a young man. This is the god Dionysus or Bacchus, the god of the grape, the god of wine, a god of wildness here depicted in the very kind of serene, almost mellowed perhaps by the wine that he's drinking. This is the god of wildness, but he looks very unwild here. Now there's a nice little kind of hidden picture. You see this wine decanter down here, which I've blown up. Maybe you can quite see it here. Caravaggio puts his own self-portrait kind of hidden there in the wine there. I think I have if you look at it a different, in black and white, you can see the little head there hiding in the wine. Maybe a reflection of him, maybe as if he's, painting. He had Bacchus or whoever this young man was to sit for the portrait. And there's a reflection of him. It reminds me of that stuff we saw like in the Northern Renaissance with those mirrors in the background. But there he is lurking. Maybe he's also trying to say something about himself as kind of soaked, drowning in a glass of wine. Is this a reflection of some of the problems that he was having at the time? Who knows? Here's another one. Artists, musicians, kind of backstage getting ready for performance. In Rome, he ran with artists and musicians, which were, by and large, these were not wealthy people. They were fairly at the bottom rung of society. Unless you were like a Michelangelo and a Leonardo, and you were getting, excuse me, commissions from popes and cardinals and families like the Medici, you were scraping by. So he hung out with those lower rungs, and here, this is him in the background, again, a self-portrait, but hanging up with these musicians getting ready for a gig, as it were. And it's kind of a nice slice of life. It's not the performance. It's backstage. It's kind of very down to earth. It's almost like, a snapshot that surprised these guys as they were trying to focus on their tuning their instruments and maybe looking at lyrics and such. Now, he quickly makes kind of leaps forward. If you compare this painting, at least to my eye, to this painting, he's experimenting with light and shadow, and this is really where he finds himself as an artist. He starts to get some of these religious commissions. Churches start recognizing his talent, and this is where I think he kind of comes alive and into his genius. This is a biblical scene, or a scene inspired by the Christian Gospels. This is the calling of the disciple Matthew, who was famously a tax collector, and he's called away from that job by Jesus to join him as one of his disciples. And so here we have Jesus, and just the fact that he depicts Jesus with this very thin halo. It was still kind of expected that you would mark these figures with elements that would mark them as holy. That was expected. But Caravaggio, you notice that this is, by the way, this is disciple Peter, who's usually depicted with a halo. Matthew with a halo. He doesn't give halos to the human disciples, and he gives Jesus just a thin one. And notice how Jesus himself is kind of thinly shrouded, or not thinly, but kind of darkly shrouded in the shadows here. It's just like that. He's kind of emerging from the shadows, and he's pointing towards Matthew and saying, "Come follow me." And Matthew's pointing at himself as to say, "What? Who me? Really?" But no, the lighting is incredible. The realism is up several notches. You'll notice also Christ's hand here. It's not kind of a forceful, finger point. It's kind of that gentle, kind of curved figure, and it's thought that Caravaggio here, it's an homage to Michelangelo, kind of that gentle, curved, kind of soft, almost emotionless finger point mimics the same kind of thing that you see in Adam's hand, where he almost touches the hand of God on the Sistine Chapel. His paintings also start to veer towards the horrific, and here we see some of that Baroque wildness coming out. This is a story from what's called the Apocrypha, these kind of books of the Bible, kind of between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's the story of young Judith who beheads Holofernes here. And so we see her in the act of beheading and the blood jetting out of his neck and the grimace of horror and pain on his face. Other things along these lines, he paints this famous head of Medusa. You see the gore from her neck. She's her head has been removed from her body by Perseus, but she's still a dread, powerful being whose gaze can still turn you into stone. He painted this on a curved surface. It presents itself as a small shield, which you don't get here from my slide. Here's another religious commission. This is the crucifixion of Peter, who, as we talked about in a previous lecture, tradition says that he was crucified during the martyr of Christians under Nero in the late 60s AD. And the tradition says that Peter requested to be crucified upside down. And so these here are the crucifixioners. Notice how they're all kind of, their faces are hidden, either under the cross, buried in shadow, behind his own arm, and just the light kind of coming down from heaven, revealing kind of this old Peter. Again, this is not the perfected, resurrected body of a saint. This is an old man who is kind of feeling the horror and the pain in this moment. It's, again, that focus, particularly in these religious paintings, these Christian paintings, focusing on that horror and focusing on that emotion and removing the halo and making these very, very human was something new and it hadn't really been done before. And it was kind of a strong veer away from kind of in some ways, kind of the control of the church and how these things should be displayed, to the freedom of an artist to focus on these human emotions and events. Here's another one. It's the death of the Virgin Mary, and here too, she's just died, and these people are coming in to kind of confirm her death and also to kind of mourn her death. But here too, to depict the Virgin Mary in this very human way, and with the pale of death upon her face. Can you just see that thin halo? He's got still that tradition. In the Catholic tradition, the figure of Mary, of course, is deeply holy. Just under the Christ, and so she still gets a halo. But the focus here is on her humanity and her mortality, and the fact that she was human and that she did indeed die. Back to his biography. So he starts to gain commissions. He starts to get the attention of some of these wealthy patrons and the Catholic Church. Being in Rome, the Vatican takes notice of him. But he continues kind of his seedier lifestyle. He's getting some money, but he's spending it as quickly as he can, it seems. He's living in the slums, and he had this reputation of snapping at the smallest provocation. The most innocent thing could set him off, and could descend quickly into a fight or some kind of awful rivalry, that a grudge that he simply would not let go. A huge turning point in his life comes in 1606, which would have made him, mid-30s at this point. He gets into a duel with a local pimp, Ranuccio Tomasoni. His name survives, and we don't know what the fight was about. But they get into a fight, and it turns violent. And Caravaggio is armed with a dagger. He stabs him in the groin and delivers a blow that kills him. And so historians debate, what were they fighting about? Unpaid debt. Some people think it was something as innocuous as over a game of tennis, which was very popular in Rome at this time. Were they fighting over a woman? Was there a personal insult? We don't know. But Caravaggio is now a murderer, and the word gets around very quickly, and he's a wanted man, and there's warrants out for his arrest, and he flees rather than face the facts. He makes his way ultimately down. So Rome is up here. He goes down to Naples. He makes it to the island of Sicily, and ends up taking a ship to this tiny little island of Malta down here, where he holds up for quite some time. And there he's welcomed in. He's actually received into this renowned order of knights, fairly kind of upper echelon society, the Order of the Knights of Malta, and kind of under the banner of their influence and importance and reach. He's protected for some time, but he continues to get in trouble. A lot of stuff. We don't really know what he's doing, but eventually he's thrown into jail, and he's stripped of his title from the Order of the Knights. And again, he's a man on the outs. He really has nowhere to go. He's still painting feverishly at this point. This was a painting of his that was actually rediscovered not so long ago, I think in somebody's attic or in Ireland. This popped up. But this is the betrayal of Jesus. This is Judas kissing Jesus right before his arrest by the Romans and taken off to be interrogated and ultimately crucified. And there's an interesting turn in Caravaggio's art at this time period. He seems to be kind of trying to deal with his own guilt from what he's done and wrestling kind of with his own culpability in the life that he's led and killing the man in Rome. So here we have this most famous act of betrayal in the Christian story, and see the pain and the sadness on Jesus' face as Judas betrays him. And this man back here is holding up a lamp so that the Roman soldiers can see who they're arresting. And Caravaggio paints his own face there. So again, he kind of implicates himself in the betrayal of Jesus. Is this a man who's wrestling with his own guilt in some of the things that he's done? His last years, he finally escapes from Malta, flees back to Italy, and he kind of makes a last dice roll. He's going to appeal to the Pope. He's had some important commissions from important higher ups in the Vatican, so maybe he can use some of those connections, some of those friends, maybe to get in a message to the Pope, and maybe he can get a pardon. And so he's making his way back up to the Vatican to seek this. And he's made some contacts with some friends he's hoping will kind of pave the way for this. So his friends are working for him. He sails from Naples and he's heading back towards Rome. But he's arrested somewhere on the coast between Naples and Rome. Lots of mystery exactly what's happening here. But he's arrested and then he's released in 1610. And so he's around age 39 or so. And he dies on the beach there at a small town called Porto Ercole, which is the backslide here. It's now this beautiful kind of picturesque town on the Mediterranean Sea. But he dies there on the beach, and we don't really know how or why. Was he murdered? Was it fever? Was it lead poisoning? We don't know. But maybe his lifestyle caught up with him, but he was only 39 years old, and he died there. And his body was buried in a kind of a mass grave there, or kind of shuttled away in kind of a church graveyard where his bones were mixed or set alongside many other artist bones. And up until fairly recently, his grave was unknown until there was done an archaeological kind of exploration of these graves and separating them out. And they found the cache of bones that actually belonged to Caravaggio. And they could prove, I don't know all the story, but they were able to kind of separate them and prove them. And by testing the bones, they found a kind of a high lead content, which was often true. Art at this time, they used paints with a high lead content. That gets on your hands and seeps into your skin, gets into your bloodstream. Maybe that was something that hastened his death. We don't really know. Here's a box with a few of the fragments of Caravaggio's bones. I don't think a full skeleton was found, but they found some bones here that they had been identified as the body of Caravaggio, and now have been kind of buried and marked properly with his name and his dates. Thus ends Caravaggio. Now, the next guy I want to talk about is Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who, in my opinion, in Western art is the greatest sculptor who's ever lived, surpassing even Michelangelo, in my opinion. And I recognize such things are subjective. He died, he lives more or less kind of the generation right after Caravaggio, 1598 to 1680, lived a nice long life and free of a lot of the turbulence that haunted Caravaggio. This is a self-portrait. He was like a Michelangelo. He was one of these guys that could do it all. He could paint, he could design, architecture, large monumental architectural pieces, whole buildings, oil painting, fresco, everything. But he was most famous for his ability to sculpt and to find kind of the softness in the marble. And so I just want to show you a few of these things. Again, here this kind of shouting, shrieking man with the lines on his face and the interpret the look the way you want. Is it horror? Is it anger? Is it shock? Is it surprise? Is it excitement? Whatever it is, it's turbulent. It's over the top. His hair is kind of splayed out. It follows the kind of the twisting of the head and the grimacing of the mouth. Over here, one of my favorites, this woman with her closed eyes behind this veil, again, all carved out of one single piece of marble. It's Bernini sculptures that have always made me want to reach out to touch them to make sure they're marble, because they have such a kind of a hyper realism and a softness about them. Here's a woman on a couch, here in a more kind of a seductive, almost kind of erotic pose with these these sheets playing about her calves and ankles as she falls asleep. The softness of the pillow, the realism of the body. It's extraordinary, and how she kind of sinks into the mattress of this couch or this bed. One of his most famous ones is his telling of the tragedy of Apollo and Daphne. And so in this story, Apollo is shot with an arrow of Cupid, which makes him fall into kind of uncontrollable lust, not the kind of the romantic love that we associate with the Valentine's cards. Cupid, Eros in antiquity, was a deeply serious, powerful, dangerous deity. So he shoots Apollo with his arrow of lust, and he shoots Daphne with his arrow of kind of disdain and disgust, just to kind of show who's really boss around here. And so Apollo chases her through the forest, and Daphne, horrified, runs away. And just before Apollo can catch her, and in the most famous tellings of the story is the clear subtext that if he catches her, they're not going to have a love affair. He's going to violently rape her. And she screams out to the gods for help, and the gods at that last minute help her by changing her into a tree before Apollo can consummate what he's intending to do. So here the sculpture shows this moment of just as Apollo kind of grabs Daphne, but her fingers are sprouting leaves and her hair is turning into foliage. Down below, kind of the bark is crawling up her body and her toes are taking a root. And I don't have the best angle here, but again, I think that Bernini's he is juxtaposing even just kind of the calm emotionlessness of Apollo, even though the act that he's intending is very violent, and then the horror and the turbulence of motion in the face of Daphne. And that juxtaposition only kind of underlines and inflates the horror of the scene. Very, very Baroque. Here's another lion, again, very realistic, but also but hyper realistic. You see the ribs and the jut of the shoulder blades and the hips back here. It's a lion, but it's an over the top lion. It's hyper realistic, and so he's hearkening back to those Hellenistic sculptures, and here in the so-called Baroque period. Now he's also famous. He left his mark on Rome too. Here we see an aerial view of Rome. The whole Vatican Square was his design and such, as well as many things inside the cathedral, which we looked at when we talked about St. Peter's a little bit ago. We'll look at that in detail in just a moment. And then also this piazza here, this kind of famous Piazza Navona, which is famous now in Rome for kind of a lively nightlife. You'll have artists painting and musicians playing and such. But you can see kind of the shape of it. It was an ancient Roman stadium, and so kind of the houses that surround the piazza, this open part in the middle, were kind of built on the foundations of the kind of the circus, kind of the oval of the circus, and it becomes something quite different today. Yeah, so here's Piazza Navona. Here you can see it very clearly. This was once a racetrack for horse racing and other games as well. And now it's an open piazza. There's a church on one side. These alleys on four sides lead into it. It's a very beautiful, charming spot. And there are these three fountains. And Bernini made this wonderful sculpture of four rivers here in the middle, which I'll show you in just a moment. Yeah, so here a close-up. There's one of many obelisks that the Romans took from ancient Egypt and brought back to Rome. Here it's set up as the centerpiece of the sculpture fountain, and then you have these four figures on all sides of the fountain, and water coming out of each, and they represent kind of four notable rivers from around the world. There's you can see the symbol of one of I forget which pope he did this for, but the pope who commissioned this sculpture gets to put his own sign, his own what would we call this? I'm blanking on you know what I'm talking about. The symbol for your family or whatever. Yes, and again, monumental, very realistic, and very wild and unpredictable at the same time. He also designed Vatican Square, which you can see is not really a square; it's another oval here. But after St. Peter's, the current church was finished. Things kept being added to it, and they employed the artists of the next century to beautify the place and to make it something spectacular. And so Bernini was the one who designed all of these things. And there's a row of columns in the front, and there's a row of columns on the outside back here too. And there are certain circles. I don't think you can see them in this photo, but there's certain circles that you can stand on in the pavement. And when you stand them and you look at the columns, they're all lined up perfectly. So it looks like like kind of one row of columns, and then you take a half step to one side, and you can see the columns behind start to appear. So there's a lot of it emphasizes the kind of the geometric perfection of the site. Here's a shot of the same square taken from the dome of at the top on the lantern at the top of St. Peter's here, and there you can see the Bernini square here. And as I understand it, they're meant to be kind of these arms that are supposed to kind of welcome the faithful as you kind of come up the boulevard here and you enter into the Vatican officially as you kind of cross this threshold. It's as if the arms of the square, the arms of Bernini, are kind of welcome you and kind of gathering you. They're almost like you almost look like kind of shepherd's crooks, right? And they're gathering the faithful into the church. Yes, and inside the St. Peter's Cathedral, he designed this this altar kind of balcony piece that stands over the high altar where the Pope will celebrate Mass and the like. And then down below here, there's the grottos, which are roughly the level of the first St. Peter's, and then further down below that is where you find that necropolis with the grave of St. Peter, which we looked at in a previous lecture. And here too, this is extremely Baroque, right? Even the pillars here, they're supposed to look like kind of wooden tree trunks, and just kind of covered. Every little piece is covered with design, with detail. To my eye, almost too much. It going over the top. More is more, and so the altar Bernini is very much a Baroque monument. I would have a hard time believing Michelangelo would have designed anything like this. His would have been much more balanced, harmonious, simple, and a kind of that classical restraint. But here in the Baroque period, like in the Hellenistic period, there's no such thing as restraint. Go crazy, go hyper real. All right, that's all I got for you this week. I will talk to you all soon.